Welcome to the Create Smarter podcast. We're revamping it and we're going to start off with some really cool things. What we're going to try to do today is break down some of the latest creative projects that in the video space that have captured our attention. So for today's episode, we're going to talk about a project we just wrapped, the Boston University's Donors Open Door campaign. And for this episode, I have Phil DiMartino, host, owner, every fun thing here at Five Tool, but also the project manager for this campaign. And Connor Clarity. Connor Clarity was the producer for this campaign. So, fellas, give a quick little intro of yourself, and then we'll kind of jump into this project.
Yeah, excited for the Create Smarter podcast to be back and excited to be chatting with you guys. And I think this is a great example of a project that was equal parts fun and interesting and, really came together in a great way. So, yeah, excited to talk about it a little bit more.
Yeah, same here. And just to piggyback off Phil, I mean, this project's a really good example of a lot of pre-production, a lot that went into the on-site one day, a lot going on that day in the real shoot, and then a lot of post-production as well, and a lot of collaboration for the whole team.
Yeah, really cool example of how pre-production can make a great end product.
Yes.
So much of the work, it's the iceberg theory, right? You don't see so much of the work, necessarily at the end, but this doesn't become a cool project without tons and tons of work up front. So,
yes.
Yeah, full transparency. I was on the shoot, so I completely understand the amount of pre-prod you guys put into this. So let's kick it off. Phil, walk us through the concept phase of this project. Who approached you? How did this all work out?
Yeah, so the folks from BU who we've worked with in the past came to us with basically an idea based on the fact that they saw a video that they really liked, another commercial that they saw actually, it was a fast-paced commercial. There was a lot of different scenes in it. It was, under a minute. It was a minute in length, but the actual part of the commercial that they really liked was well under a minute. It was just about a 10-second scene. And it kind of sparked an idea for them to go down the road of a whole concept. So in the commercial that they liked, there was a scene where it was kind of a tracking shot where it cut to a lot of different people pushing through open doors, getting out of cars. And it was this cool frame that allowed you to see different people in different settings, but kind of how they were all the same. And that really just sparked an idea for them for their own project about the idea of donors opening doors at BU. And that was basically the genesis of it. And from there, we kind of had to figure out, okay, well, that's the start of an idea. How does that actually become a fully fledged concept for you guys?
So is it unusual to me, it sounds like they had a scene in mind and they're like, we got to make a video off of that. Is that unusual? Like, do most of the clients kind of approach you when it comes to video production more with a, hey, here's our goal in mind?
Most clients don't come to us with a specific video, like, hey, here's a video, here's a scene, like, let's make something based off of that. So I do think it is a little bit unusual. You would agree, right?
Yeah, it's rare that you'd see inspiration from something.
But it's great.
Because the client, and this is no offense to them, but they don't really think like that. That's more our job. That's why they come to us.
Right, but I think it's great when you do get it. And there are definitely some times when people come to you and there's inspired, hey, I saw this thing. And I think the thing that sometimes people get caught up in, and the reason they don't bring those inspiration ideas to you is that ultimately the video that BU brought to us was very, very, very different from what we ended up producing.
Right.
Mm-hmm. So I think sometimes people look at something and they say, well, yeah, that was interesting, but that's not what I want to do. And that makes them hesitate from bringing that forward. But in reality, in the case of the video that they brought to us, a 7-second scene is enough to spark the whole idea.
Easy to copy and paste onto another. But I see what you're saying. I think there could be like, well, what does this video with cars have to do? How do we put that in a higher education university lens? And you're like, well, it's that's a scene. That's an easy camera shot that we can replicate. Let's just see how we can do it in your realm.
And the reality is everything that's building around it, sure, it's different, and we'll talk about that in a second. But I love when people come to us with a specific idea, like, hey, here's a video I love, even if it has nothing to do with the industry or the topic or whatever, because it's just a place to start from, and at least what they like, right? And what they think their audience is going to like. So it could have nothing at all to do from an end product standpoint with what you're going to be creating, but at least you have a sense of like, hey, here's what these people think is interesting and what they think looks good.
Right. I do that all the time when I worked other places. I'd be like, send me some examples. Like, especially when they came to you with an idea, you'd be like, okay, can you send me examples of what you're thinking? Because then I can at least picture what you're doing, when half the time you're having a conversation, you're like, I'm trying to think of what's in your head. And like, I don't know what you've watched. I don't know what you're interested in. I don't know what you find interesting. So for Boston University to come to you with this kind of concept of like, hey, we think this shot type is really dope and we want to do videos with this. I mean, it's got to be just a breath of fresh air.
Super helpful. I mean, from where
100%.
I sit.
100%. Because it's easy too. That was a newish type of shot for us. We'll get into equipment later, but But it was just a good jumping off point where you say, okay, how do we just replicate this? We don't really have to think too much about that specific part. It's like they came to us with the climax of their movie and we just had to make the rest of it, the beginning and the end.
So talk to me a little bit. What was their goal, right? We know they came with the concept, but as you talked to them as a project manager and stuff, what was Boston University's goal with this video?
Yeah, so we do a lot of work with annual giving teams. So specifically in higher ed fundraising, annual giving is the arm of fundraising that goes back to donors year after year and raises funds for current use projects. So all that means is that year in and year out, they go to people and they're not really trying to raise large amounts of money. They're trying to get people to participate and donate to specific things that they care about year after year to help support operating budgets, more or less.
Right.
And so with annual giving teams, one of the interesting things that happens is that you have to get through your year and raise money and try to get a lot of people to donate year in and year out. But then, the fiscal year ends and it resets and you have to go through the whole process every single year.
Right.
So when the fiscal year ends, what you have to do is you have to simultaneously kind of thank the people who gave over the course of last year, but then also try to remind them that we would really love it if you would kind of come back and continue to support us
Right.
next year, which is right now.
Rent's due. Rent's not really.
But only if you're generous enough to pay us.
Yeah.
And I mean, I think the key part to that is that you have to be constantly demonstrating to them, A, that you are doing a good job of using their money in an effective way. B, that you really are thankful for the fact that they chose to prioritize your organization over all the other ones that they could choose. And see that there's other opportunities to do more of this moving forward. Like, we're not done. This is an ongoing thing. So this concept was really trying to accomplish a little bit of all of that, really designed to talk to the people who donated in fiscal year 2022, which ends for BU on June 30th, to talk to the thousands of people that donated in that year and say, hey, because of you, we're opening all of these great doors and unlocking these great opportunities for students. You're amazing. Thank you so much. Like, the work continues, right? And kind of trying to embody all of that in a single video, which is challenging, but I think they've historically done a great job of that, and they have had a lot of experience with it. But I think this video really did accomplish that.
So it's good that they have the foundation built into that, because I mean, as we know with video, right? It's not a flip the switch. As much as we love our smartphones and as easy as it is to create content in this world that we currently live in, it takes me to a little bit of the timeline. How did this all work out for you? Because at least Boston University has this foundation when it comes to their annual giving of how they use video as a tool. But what was the timeline? Because I know what we shot this in, and I didn't realize that was the whole, like, when they needed this video out by.
Yeah. No, it was a pretty quick turnaround. I remember, going to some pre-production meetings with the client or just us. It was kind of a faster paced time period because they needed it such quick turnaround, like I said.
Right.
I don't know the exact date they wanted to post it or whatever, but it was kind of like, okay, we have this meeting now. Let's say in a month's time, we should be in a pretty good space of where things have been shot and things have been edited and like first drafts are done. And all. So from like concept to, pre-production meetings to actually getting locations and talent and on-site shoot dates was like real fast. I mean,
yeah, I think, it's always interesting when you're working around a specific deadline.
Right.
And there is a time-bound element to something like this because I mentioned the fiscal year. The fiscal year is kind of the guiding light for everything you do in annual giving. And by the time you get to September, October, November, the next thing is already coming up.
Right.
So the opportunity to thank people and kind of steward them from the previous fiscal year, that clock's ticking, and you kind of have to take care of that before you can't start asking again and making the case again until you've kind of acknowledged and been like, hey, we really appreciate you. And so that has to happen over the summertime in annual giving. And there's specific other components of the campaign beyond just the video that this ties into. So there's direct mail and there's email and there's a whole bunch of elements that have to kind of come together and go out at once. So this video is just one piece of that puzzle for them, but it all had to happen basically in mid-July in order to be ready to go out. And we started working on it, I think, in early June, right around there.
That's awesome.
And it's actually, in my opinion, a lot of times it's really helpful to have a firm deadline, even if it's kind of a tight turnaround, because it forces action on our end and it forces action on the client's end in order to really get moving. And sometimes projects can drag out and people can drag their feet. And if you have a tight deadline, you just don't have the
You
opportunity
start to
do
trip
that.
over that finish line. Yeah. Because especially, like I say, getting locations, getting students, what student is checking their email and wants to come back to campus during the summer? This is like the hardest thing to get. So, so they're really good about, communication back and forth with us, kind of getting locations, contacts, all that sort of stuff for the actual shoot day to happen smoothly.
Yeah, they were all over it. And I mean, that's the ideal is it's a lot of coordination. So that's, there's a double-edged sword with the tight deadline, but it does force your hand. And
it's kind of nice, right?
A little bit of luck there too to get everyone you want in the shoots.
Very true. Yes. So let's jump into it. Let's talk pre-production. I mean, what was that? Talk to me about the process. How did you guys approach it? Once the contract signed, everything's good. I kind of know a little stuff that we won't dive into for the podcast, but I mean, contract gets signed. What's the first step, and kind of how did you kind of get everything leading up to the day of shooting?
Yeah, I think really the interesting thing about people coming to you with a specific idea is you kind of have to narrow down and find out like, well, which part of this do you like and how can we use that as inspiration? So I think our first step was really to narrow that down. And then from there, Connor, you can talk a little bit more about it, but it's basically, putting together, this is a really scripted video. A lot of times we'll do more free-form videos that we're going to go interview people and kind of, we base our post-production based on what we get from interview content.
Right.
But in a situation like this, it's a lot more pre-planned and scripted, and we're going to get what we get. So Connor actually went through the process of kind of developing 3 different specific types of end products that they could kind of choose from to kind of think about that storyboard and how it was going to develop.
Yeah, and I think in our minds, it's always better to come to the client with options.
Right.
Like that's always said. I mean, they usually pick the second one or whatever the little trick is. But when they gave us that initial idea, like Phil said, it was like, okay, you gave us this part. How do we make the rest of the video? So we kind of came 3 different storyboards. 2 of them had more real like characters involved where we follow student stories from they're all together at the beginning, then they split up and what other paths they go to and what doors they open. Another one was how do we really get the donor and student relationship in this video? I think it was a student is struggling to open a door of many different kinds, and then a donor or alumni, whoever comes up and says, "Oh, let me help you real quick." So it's a physical donor opening a door for a student.
Right.
And then the idea we initially, or not initially, but finally landed on was kind of like, okay, let's really step back and just what's the concept of this video is doors. So how do we incorporate doors and BU with maybe nostalgia, maybe iconic looking doors, whatever. And that's the idea that we came up with is just getting pictures and video of doors all around BU and then throwing them all together and then having students physically walk through that door. I mean, what's easier than that? And yeah, it was a couple meetings back and forth, but then once we came to it and we presented that idea to them, they kind of picked which one they liked. And then after that, it was just an easy process of, all right, pick 5 different locations. What kind of, I don't know what to call them, but study areas, let's say, like research areas or labs or a place on campus where students go, or athletics, or whatever types of areas of the university that they want to focus on. What location does that talk to, and what door does that, opens?
Yeah, where's it correlate with?
Into the scene. So after they picked the storyboards, then it went into shot lists and scheduling and scripting, and luckily they wrote the kind of VO script for us, which was the easy part. So it was just putting
the voiceover. Right, okay.
Someone on BU's team wrote that for us.
Oh, okay.
So that was easy given to us, first draft, whatever. It was easy to build a storyboard or a shot list even for the final video before we even shot anything.
So which came first, the VO script or the storyboard?
Well, yeah.
We had a very rough,
it was a
ugly VO script.
VO.
Okay.
So for a project like this, it's an interesting point you bring up because it's kind of, you mentioned it's kind of a chicken or the egg sort of thing. You have to have an idea of what's going to be said at what point in a video like this, if there is a voiceover. But, they have people on their team who are script writers and who work to write content for BU every day. Like they know the voice and the specific verbiage that they want to use. But when you build a storyboard, there have to be some words. So the first draft of the storyboard, wherever that lives, is probably very shorthand versions of like, oh, yada, yada, there's a locked door here.
Something along the lines of,
exactly.
Who opens door into student.
Well, it's got to be interesting because, you talk about how it's a campaign, right? A video isn't the one thing for this. So it is mailers. It's all this other stuff. So they have copywriters who are doing this on their staff. And the collaboration that with like video production, what we do here at 5 Tool is so fascinating because you got people who can finally like hey, we know what we want to talk about. We're not going to a script writer. We know this campaign. We know what language is in it. We want to make sure that our donors who saw our campaign leading up to it, during it, and after it all have the same language, so they understand this is the same thing. But also at the same point, you got people who are just used to direct mailers. All of a sudden they're like, video, how do I write for video? Oh, yeah. So that's where it's probably a fun in the sense of like working back and forth and being collaborative with someone. You got to kind of hold their hand a little bit as video production, but at the same time, they're bringing this like, here's what this needs to say because my audience has been reading this in direct mailers and email campaigns and now all these other things, right?
Yeah. So, and I mean, that's the benefit of working with a team that is mature in the sense of like they're used to multimedia campaigns and like they understand like the urgency of getting a script together compared to like the other elements. And so like they're not holding things up and they know how these things work together. So, just to go back to the planning, the really interesting thing you think about, I haven't thought about this too much, but the other storyboards that we came up with, ultimately like the message and the video is the same, but those other two videos would have been completely different videos.
So different, yeah.
And you wonder, you always kind of be like, I want to go in the multiverse here and just see the end product.
Doctor
Would that
Strange.
have been good?
How do we get into that? Because there's so many more moving parts in the other things like actors and like scripted scenes.
And they get a little, and looking at this one specifically, like I actually think those other concepts were a little more convoluted. Mm-hmm. And sometimes you go down the path of like, we have to be super specific and we have to like have a person representing this. And you don't always need that. I think like simple, this was still, I think the message got across and I think you have to trust your audience, right?
Right.
This is an intelligent audience. They are people who are already engaged with your institution in the sense that they are donors. So like they're going to get it, right? And I think trusting your audience a little, so like you don't have to beat them over the head with really spelling everything out. You can have a little more subtlety and you can play with it a little more and you can let the doors be the characters a little more than as opposed to like having a physical representation of everything. So like thinking about the other paths this could have gone, I do believe that we ended up going down the one that would be the most effective video.
The correct one.
But I think those other ones would have been cool too and different in their own way. I wish there was a way we could see how they would have played out. But
how unique is it that you come up with 3 different storyboards? Or is that something that just because this individual client came with a concept, you kind of have to find a way, whereas usually they come with sort of a goal, you can kind of create that one storyboard, or do you normally come up with 3 storyboards?
Well, in my experience, it's kind of been less involved of a storyboard, but it's more like you come to the client with a smorgasbord of ideas, almost throw stuff against the wall and see what sticks.
Right.
They'll be like, these are really cool ideas, and like these 2 are kind of the most doable. So the client will be like, oh, those are all good, and we'll kind of keep them on back burner, but let's do this one. But with this concept, because I think they came with us with a scene in mind, with a shot in mind kind of deal, and we built around that, as we've talked about, it was easier to say, we kind of broke it up into like beginning, middle, end. And it was like, okay, the middle for all of these shots
is always going to be there.
It's going to be the same. We already have it. We have
right.
people and doors with that shot from the commercial. And it was more like, okay, how do we get there? And then after that, what happens?
Okay.
And so that was the, for me, it was a fun part of being like, okay, here's some 3 overarching video ideas, and then here's your middle, make the rest of the 3 videos. And that was a fun process to then come to them and say, okay, come in my brain for a minute. Let me, because it's easy on paper, but it's tough to tell. But
that is the tricky part about it. And having the storyboard does make it a little bit easier,
right?
As opposed to just like most of the time, it is just more like, all right, here's the idea,
right?
Exterior scene, and you kind of have to set it for them. So if you have the opportunity to actually build out a full storyboard that says like, hey, the visual is this, the sound is this, the voiceover is this, even if it's a sample voiceover with nonsense words that we came up with, it does give a much better and timing too, right?
Yes,
you have estimated timing. That's you're much closer to the final product there. So like the client then gets to go into it with a little more clarity too, going into the shoot of understanding like, oh, here's exactly what I'm going to get.
What about when it comes to kind of location and talent? How important does kind of scripted narrative like this video is help with it comes time to planning the locations that you're going to go to, the talent that you're going to have? Because like you said, it was filmed in June, and up here in Boston, that's sort of when college kids are starting to get out of school, they're going home, they're traveling back. How important was it having that script with that storyboard that helped you guys kind of settle on location, settle on here's who we kind of need in the shots when we're going to do this?
Yeah, I mean, it's a collaborative process too, though, because part of the pre-planning is also talking to BU we're trying to talk to donors about the things they care about. So it's also trying to think about, the elements that a lot of people supported in this past fiscal year and what we think is going to be important to them. So the client kind of identifies different areas of the university that they think are going to resonate with a lot of people and showing those off. So it does start from the priorities of like, here's 5 or 6 different topic areas that we think are important for us to highlight based on the people we're sending this to. Okay, what can we get on campus in June that's going to represent those areas?
Yeah, and that changes too, because you can have a pretty broad thing. Like, you don't want to go too niche of like, the super specific rocket club or whatever, because some donors might be like, I don't care about that. So you want to have pretty broad topics, but then you get into, okay, I want one scene or character to be athletics. And you're like, okay, what can we get? So I remember in a couple different versions of the storyboard or script or whatever, originally it was a basketball player. And so all of my shots were based on close-up of dribble, close-up of swish, close-up of basketball, So then it comes to pretty close to production, and then suddenly something might change where a location or an actor or a student, you can't get a basketball player. So now we have to kind of pivot and say, okay, what else can we get? What other location is available, and what other student athlete, can we shoot with?
Yeah, and I think a lot of times, especially working with higher ed, you're working with students, and there's different availability. Maybe they suddenly have an exam they have to worry about, or they have to travel home because they have to see their family, or they say, you know what, I thought about this and I just don't want to be a part of it, and all those things are fine. And so I think like one of the things that we've learned in our experiences working with higher ed over the years is flexibility, and you get into these shoots and best laid plans, like there's never an initial draft of a script that doesn't change when you're working with students, because it's, first of all, it's a lot of different people, and they're all volunteers, which is awesome, because like the thing is, the best student volunteers for these shoots are ones who like, yeah, I want to be in a video that's going to thank donors, right?
Right.
But they are all volunteers, and so like priorities change and things change, and they're not always going to be available, which is fine. So I think the biggest thing is being flexible. So like building an idea in a storyboard that isn't dependent on like one person or one topic is really important here. You mentioned like being able to pivot from one sport to another. It's really important to think of these more as like 30,000 foot view to start, and like narrow it down as we go, because things are going to change, and that's okay.
Yeah. And so even I might be jumping, but the shot list, I'm just thinking those have really close correlations to, okay, if you give me a location and an idea of what we're filming, I'm going to come up with some really general shots that even if it does switch, I'm just thinking of, let's say a lab, for example, we didn't know exactly what type of lab we were going to get in there with. And at the end of the day, it does matter for something like physically basketball, soccer ball, whatever, but it's still athlete and ball interacting. You get into a lab space, there's going to be beakers, there's going to be buttons, there's going to be fancy stuff. Because again, and that's what a lab is to me.
Swishes.
It's all
fancy stuff.
But yeah.
We are scientific Americans.
Yeah, exactly.
It's one of the very interesting things, especially when it comes to video production. It's how do you find like people who aren't just used to only working with actors, right? This is scripted narrative. This is something that if 9 times out of 10, you would think that the video production company is going to bring on extras, bring on all these actors you can read on screen, but you miss the authenticity that you get when you actually have real users, real people and stuff like that. So it is something that a really good video production company like Five Tool itself is working through, making sure you can be flexible and pivot, especially with this type of stuff, because it isn't a commercial shoot. It is, but it isn't. The audience and who you're talking to, you got to be able to really have the right people come on.
No, it has to be real.
Right.
And that was a priority for them too, because you can't tell donors, hey, you're impacting the lives of these real students and then not show students. I mean, that's just not how it works, right? Like you have to show students. So this is, a real athlete, a real student, a real person who works in a real lab. I mean, like, it's really important if you're focusing on the impact on students that you show students,
Oh, 100%. So let's talk about it finally. Kind of what was the plan? What was the schedule for the thing? How many people were going to be on the team? How many people were you going to have go to the shoot day? And kind of what were things that was kind of top of your mind when it was leading up to that final day of actually, hey, we're going to Boston University. We're going to start filming this.
Yeah. Well, initially right out the gate, we were like kind of going in with the idea of we're going to split up into 2 teams already, because one big part of the video was still photos of the doors that just go out and capture all the pictures of every door you can possibly find, while everybody else is kind of filming the B-roll and the actual videos of students walking through doors. And so we kind of came into it knowing, okay, we needed a couple teams, so a couple people. The number was variable, didn't really matter, but the teams were that. And then scheduling wise, it was, again, it all goes against location and what people we can get, the volunteers. And we built our schedule from there once we were in contact with different facility people and different coaches and different lab managers and stuff. So that, we base our schedules off their availability.
Yeah, it's like a puzzle, right?
Right.
And you always start with, I started puzzle with the corner pieces, right? Because you can see where that fits, right?
Do the edges. You know what they look like.
There's always edges in a shoot, right? If you want to extend this this metaphor, there's always some hard and fast things. We need to be in a lab. The lab is available at this time only. Okay, well that clarifies our schedule. We're going to start there, and that's true whenever you have to do multi-location. We love multi-location shoots at 5 Tool.
We love them.
We love to be able to show.
We don't get our steps
in.
And that's always it. It always works out that one's on the other end of campus.
Yes, but that's part of scheduling too. Like if there's flexibility, you say, oh, these people are these 4 locations you can get to. We can go to them at any point during the day.
Right.
Well, let's make the ones who are 200 feet apart from each other. Let's put those back to back, right?
We would have to get in a van and drive across campus.
Sometimes not possible, but you do your best there. But yeah, no, it's I know it's so funny also thinking about the 2 teams thing. We talk about this a lot of times, especially in these scripted videos. You go through all of this work and you set up a shot and it takes an hour and a half and you're working with somebody. And we said this to one of the people in this shoot where like we had her for an hour and a half. We're like, okay, there's only going to be like 7 seconds in the final video. Right. And it's kind of funny. The same thing with like the stills, like they're a big part of the video, but spend the entire day shooting stills and it takes up, a pretty small portion of the end product, but it's vitally important. Yeah. So like those are the type of things I think when you're, if you're new to video production or whatever, that you don't necessarily think of quite how much time goes into it on the shoot day. A 7-second scene doesn't, obviously, I know it's common sense, doesn't take 7 seconds to film, but it probably takes a lot more than most people think.
Right.
Yeah.
And, things on site too change, where you go in with it. You might have a bunch of pre-production done, shot lists and schedules, and that's great. You get on site and you go, oh, the client might think something, or even your shot list said, oh no, we're going to do it this way. And you're like, okay, well, shoot, we have to pivot real fast. Or
it just doesn't look as good as you thought it would, right?
Yeah. Or maybe there's equipment stuff. There was a couple bumpy things with the dolly and we were like, this door doesn't work because it pushes this way instead of pulls this way.
Or we're not on level ground here.
Yeah,
like physically the floor is not level, right?
Right. So you have to be ready to just adapt. And that's, for us, I think, good, it's good we find that kind of fun and the energy continues with the shoot. It doesn't put a damper on our day. We're just like, okay, cool, pivot, let's go find somewhere else. And I'm just using the athlete, for example. We did must have been half an hour upstairs in the Case Gym
I was just going to mention
lobby. Did a bunch of shots, throughout that time. And then the last 10 minutes we're like, okay, just kidding. Let's go downstairs to the equipment room, the locker room, use that door. And that ended up in the final product.
Yeah. Right. And I think that's being willing to be flexible and listen to your client, because your client often does know best. It's their institution. And they said, I think maybe we try this other shot instead. Mm-hmm. And of course there's part of you that's like, we just did,
you're like, what the heck did we all do this
30, 40 minutes of shooting? But ultimately you have to like trust your client too. And then we went up and set up and got the other shot, and it was ultimately much better and it worked out. So yeah.
So that brings up an actually interesting point with the pre-production you guys talk about. Did you guys get to location scout? Did you get to go to the actual facility, see what the shot's going to look like? Is that something you normally get to do when it comes to client shoots?
So in this specific case, we didn't have the chance to do that. So when you talk about something like what happened with the athletics facility, like that was something that maybe can be mitigated by like a pre-shoot walkthrough.
Right.
In this case, we didn't have the chance to do that just based on timing. A lot of times you do, a lot of times you don't. But again, I think that also does just tie into trying to be flexible for us. Like day of, don't be so locked in and have and it's hard not to if you have a specific plan. Try not to have tunnel vision. And and I think in this case we didn't. We went in. There was a couple of times, it's like, oh, we're in a room with tons of natural light. And then there's also things you could go for a walkthrough on a cloudy day, right? And it looks totally different. You get there, it's bright sunlight, and you're like, oh, these reflections are super harsh. I didn't realize that. We have to go figure out how to close, a couple of 50-foot high shades, and you do it, and then it works out. But I think I do think the name of the game for a shoot that's it's a planned flexibility, right? Like there's a rigidity. There's a rigidity to it that you have to stay on schedule. You have to get to a certain number of locations, but within those, building buffer within your specific shoot so you have that flexibility. So you can say, we're not just going to be stuck in our ways. We want the best end product. Let's figure out how to get there. So it's a balance of rigid and flexible all in one, I think.
And that's exactly why you plan an hour for a 7-second shot.
Exactly.
Because you could get
Right.
on site and everything could be totally different. Or
Right.
like I said, equipment malfunction or talent, miscommunication or whatever it is. And thank God you had that extra buffer time, because now you can figure it out and put your heads together calmly without having to rush. Calmly, without having to rush and figure out, okay, we still can get this shot. How are we going to accomplish that goal?
Yeah.
So any good stories from the day of the shoot? Any fun things that you didn't plan on that you had to pivot for?
Well, I guess like how many frames did we shoot still did we use most of the still frames that we shot, or were there a lot that didn't make it? I'm just curious about that. Actually, I don't even know.
Yeah, I mean, I think there was definitely a lot left on the editing room floor, to be sure. I think maybe
It's just good
ballpark.
B-roll shooting right there. You
Well,
should
exactly,
have stuff
yeah.
left on the floor.
I think it's always better to have more than
Yeah,
come back to the end
right.
and be like, shoot, I wish we had,
Sure,
whatever.
sure.
But for still specifically, you must have shot probably close to 200, 300,
Right.
upwards of. And then you get back in the edit, and with timing, and if you're editing to the beat of the music, and, we had a whole conversation of how the doors played in the beginning versus the kind of faster part at the end. So at the end of the day, I don't even know.
30 maybe?
Maybe 30,
Yeah.
maybe, 30.
It doesn't hurt me and my soul at all.
No, the way you're looking at me is so bad. Because I'm going to frame them all these doors, put them all around the office.
I think an interesting part of it, and you worked on the edit, so you can talk about it more, is there's an element of this where you're opening a door and it's going to go to like a virtual scene, basically. So somebody
yeah.
pulls open a
Right,
door,
right.
and instead of going to what's actually beyond that door, you're cutting to a different scene, which in this case was commencement.
Yes.
So we were kind of keeping our eyes peeled all day for an appropriate door that would work for that use case. And then we found one at like 5:30 p.m. at the very end of the
literally
shoot.
the end of about to, in the same building where our car was parked. We were like, oh, this door will work.
And I think the debate was like, okay, do we try to reset and do that?
Yeah.
And ultimately we did.
Mhm.
And it worked out because the other option is like, we're just going to have to find a door
Yeah, here in
somewhere,
the office or
somewhere
fake
else.
it almost.
Yeah.
And that's kind of thing it goes back to, like, okay, yeah, if we had a walkthrough, maybe we could have had that be like, I know exactly where a good door would be. Because that's the other thing too. I think we got on site thinking there'd be a lot more, I don't know, normal looking doors or whatever it is. And then we're like, oh, a lot of them are kind of look very similar, whether they're
Right.
glass or whether they're,
Right.
I love the cathedral style Gothic looking Boston buildings. But after a while you get 5 of them and you're like, well, I already used 2 of those and
Right.
it all kind of looks the same.
So you're finding the variants where you can. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it's like if there's a theme to this episode, it really was you need to be agile. You need to be able to pivot. I mean, the one last story I remember from the day of the shoot was Phil, you talked to like leading up to it. You're like, because I only really went on for the shoot. I really wasn't part of pre-production. So when you gave us our little like tease up, you're like, don't worry, it's summertime. Because we're like, well, we're doing all these shoots in places that like, what if there's a bunch of
Highly
kids,
trafficked
like
areas.
lots of stuff like
Yeah.
that. You're like, it's summertime, nothing to worry about, nothing to worry
Ghost
about.
Town, I remember saying.
Did I say those words?
Ghost Town, ha ha ha, dummies. You don't have anything to worry about.
Never, for
like-
the record, for the podcast court reporter record, I
on record.
never called you dummies.
Oh, okay.
It was donkeys. You must have read it wrong.
Donkeys. Sorry, but you talked about how that was nothing to worry about in the very first one we shot. All of a sudden, every kid and their
Oh, man.
mom
Literally.
continues to walk into our shot.
It happened to be orientation.
It happened to be
It
orientation.
happened to be the first day of orientation. So,
So you got
a bunch of incoming freshmen were showing up with their parents, and we happened to be in a location directly next to a parking lot that people would use to get to a building that's a little bit hard to find. So
the only public parking lot
Yeah.
too. Like, oh,
Really
so
good.
a ton of people were just walking through. We were right next to the front door of this building, and probably a couple dozen people just walking through. Hey, can you tell me where X dorm is? Yep, right up the hill. And by the time we left, I think everybody was a BU geography expert. Everyone on
even-
shoot was, oh yeah, walk up the hill, take a left, take a left. You
Even
know.
David, who was like his first or second shoot on site, was like telling, "Oh yeah, you go up the street, take the stairs. That's
We all are honorary BU tour guides for the day. We helped a lot of incoming freshmen find their way to one of the dorms.
I
there.
just remember seeing one of the B-roll where you like run across the shot and
You're
you're
like,
like,
"Oh!"
"Dude,
Well,
hold up." You're
you
like,
start to
you're
run
Jurassic Park going your hand up, like, hold it,
Hold it.
stopping
You
the
start to run,
velociraptor.
well, you start to run out of time, and it's like we can't have someone else walk through the shot. Let's
We have to get
very, very politely and very gently say, "Hi, would you mind waiting a moment
Yeah.
before you come through these doors? Thank you so much. My name's Phil. It's nice to meet you. How are you? Okay, walk through quickly now.
Go. Did we get all the shots? Did you get everything that we intended? I mean, you storyboarded this, it's scripted. Did we leave the day with everything that we wanted to?
Everything and more, I would say. And just before we end the story parts, I think, Kyle, you'll appreciate this. One story that I know Phil wasn't present for was the booth theater fiasco.
Speaking of orientation,
where,
right? Yeah.
Of course, which, you know, it ended up being amazing, and I'm glad we can laugh about it now, because you always talk about how you go on site and you get way more B-roll than you'll ever need. But, you know, use cases down the line might be like, oh, thank God we had all that stuff from booth theater. Who knows? We do a feature on it. But so we had a shot with this, you know, one volunteer. She was going to walk through the doors, and then we were going to, you know, magically transport into the theater and have a couple cool shots
Like
with
5 shots on stage of this one person.
of like one, and then like it turns out, oh, 3 more students from this thing want to volunteer can help, and we're like, oh, cool, we can have like a crowd and like over the shoulder shot, so it, you know, kind of cooler shot. So we didn't think of. Then we get into the theater itself, and the you know, the director of the theater was like, oh, we have some people from orientation who would love to. They're not doing anything for their lunch block or whatever. They want to help, and we're like, cool, throw them in the audience, and we're gonna get the 5 shots, and we'll get out of here. That turned into, you know, every 10 minutes at least. I mean, another group of 20 kids would come in, and the client was kind of like just looking at us, was like, more people. And
Why
we're like,
not?
okay, cool. So I turned into like, I had to go back to my high school days, and I turned into a director of like, okay, you guys, group 1, my boys, you guys over here, we're going to walk when I, you know, and the dolly's going to move and everything's going to happen. And it was like a whole production.
You actually made a new musical.
I mean, literally, yeah. I mean,
Basically,
Hamilton
some-
2. And,
Electric Boogaloo.
But
We taking it to England. We were going
Yeah.
back.
Oh.
That was the
Return
change.
to the King.
Oh, wow. Was it
Yeah.
a prequel?
All Hail the King. No,
Yeah.
it was going to be after Hamilton solved it, came back from the
Solved
dead.
it.
He was going to go to
detective.
England and take him on.
Oh,
I
maybe
remember-
that's the next podcast. We're gonna break the story for
Brainstorm.
Hamilton 2, Electric Boogaloo.
the history podcast.
It was chaos, Phil.
Yeah,
Like, it
to
was
say the least. We ended up must have been 50 kids in the crowd and
Yeah.
20 kids on stage.
all of them acted. That was the craziest thing. Was they all started really going at it. We're like,
Yeah, they were
what
like
is
all
happening?
really I don't know, easy to work with, I guess is the word. Like, it was just like,
Very
I don't know what
amenable,
other
very
scenario where
excited,
you'd
yeah.
come in and, you know, a freshman own orientation is awkward already.
Yeah.
You come into a group of theater kids, as a former theater kid, I can say that, they're all awkward. So you walk into a group and these 2 guys with awful beards are yelling at, oh, do this, with cameras in your face.
You're
And-
the guys with awful
Yeah,
beards.
Yeah,
to be clear.
Kyle and I, yes.
You're not making a value judgment on anyone else's
No,
beard.
no,
Okay,
no,
good.
No, but like, they just took all the instruction and they really made some cool shots. But at the end of the day,
It was like,
use 2 of them. You know what I mean? So it's like, you love coming back from shoots with stories. You know, they'll never see that. So
And I do think from you get into the edit and
Yeah.
the really cool thing about working in a team environment like ours is that we're all in a room and, you know, we can pull up the edit on a big screen and look at it together and kind
Right.
of go back and forth. And every video is super subjective. I think that's something that sometimes is hard to keep in mind for clients, is that what you like is going to be different than what I like, than what you like, than what your audience likes.
Right.
Even if you know really specifically who your audience is, super subjective. It always comes up with music, right? No, there's no bigger point of contention in edits than music, because everybody just has different tastes, and
Yeah.
different music will trigger different things in your brain. I'm sure
creative subjective.
you could do studies on it of like
Right.
why this specific song triggers something different for you than it does for me. Anyway, super subjective process. So when you get into the edit, you know, there's 5 of us in a room watching it, and we all kind of have different things that we focus on. But I think it's a really important thing. You talk about collaboration and things like that. I really think the end product was better because you go through versions and versions and versions of it before the client ever even sees it, by the way.
before you send it out, exactly,
And,
just internally.
And it's just kind of trying to take the best feedback from everybody and have people, if not come to an agreement, come to an understanding about what are the different elements of this that we should change, and what are the little things we can do to get that margin of excellence to take it from good to great. And
Right.
that comes out most when, especially people who aren't super close to it, a couple members of the team who weren't even on the shoot, watch it and they're like, I don't get this. Explain this to me. And you're like,
Right.
okay, well, the people who are going to be watching this video from BU's audience, they weren't on the shoot. They don't know what we're going for.
Yeah.
That feedback is sometimes the most important, right? Because you can be too close to it. So that collaboration is really important.
And that's one of the hardest things I always find is you get so close to something, it becomes your baby. It becomes like your darling, and it's so hard to throw it out as creatives. I mean, it's something where you got to be able to take that feedback, realize that like, oh no, this is someone who didn't go on the whole day shoot, didn't experience the 50 kids doing an acting thing, so they don't get why you're including this. seamless. And like to the narrative, that doesn't work. And the story is a story. That's all that matters at the end of the day.
If it doesn't make sense, it doesn't make sense.
It doesn't make sense. It doesn't matter how much of a darling that thing was. You got to be able to kill it, which is one of the hardest things. I mean, Connor, you were the editor for this, right?
Correct.
So you're producer, editor, all that fun stuff. How many revisions did you end up doing?
So I was looking at this before, just to like really refresh my mind. And at the end of the day, I think it was 5 revisions on the final video. But even before that, there was 2 different versions because we didn't even know if the whole commencement part of it would really flow like we thought it would and XYZ. So even that, we had to present different drafts to the client and to ourselves to be, okay, if we include this commencement stuff with the door and the keying and all this other stuff, how does that work? And so once we kind of shuffle it around a little bit, we figured out that it did work. It did flow. There's a way to put it in the video and it looks pretty cool. And so at the end of the day, it must have been 5, then 5.1, 5.2, little stuff. But
so interesting because it's scripted. It was scripted. It was storyboarded and all that stuff. And still to have that many edits.
Right?
I mean, is that something you find unique or is that just, this is just
That's
edits?
not unique. That's not unique
it's
at all.
almost you expect it.
And sometimes clients like straight up apologize and you're like, that's the part of the process.
Right,
I think, there's no, I hate to say this out loud because I don't want to encourage people to go crazy. There's no shame in being nitpicky. This is it's their baby too, right? And like
it's going on their channels at the end of the day.
It's going to represent them, and we want it to be as good as it can be for them. So like, no, that's not unique, and I don't think like. There's also a huge difference. Think about how you feel about when you see something versus how you plan it out. Like it's going to be the same thing for them, and plus they're not the ones actually sitting down, actually editing it. So like, there's usually questions about, why did this change? Why'd you get here? And as long as you're on the same page in planning, usually those are easy conversations to have. But no, I don't find that to be unique at all.
No, it's definitely not. But it's helpful for us too because they, like what you're saying, it's their product at the end of the day, and it's their channels. So when they come to stuff like brand guidelines or things that have to do with the brand or school in this situation itself that we might not even think of, like our final shot, we were like, that looks like a really cool shot, but they were like, oh, but it has dates involved, so we want to grandfather this.
And they live it and breathe it.
So and we were like, but the shot looks really good, and you kind of have to like be able to be like, okay, the shot does look good, but they want this shot, so let's use that shot.
Right.
You just have to be able to be like, okay, yeah, this isn't mine. I'm not gonna, after I'm done with this, I'm not gonna go home and put this on my fridge. I mean, it's a video.
It's collaborative.
That's the hard thing of working for a production company versus working for like
the company itself.
Is that we have certain ideas, but often what we're thinking of is, in a different realm, it's important for the project. Does this look good? Does this sound good? All of that stuff. And that's important to them too. But like above all else, the focus is on brand.
Right.
Right. And we have to keep that in mind for them too. Like, is this your voice? Is this your brand? And that's really important. And we try to focus on that. And I think we do. But those are a lot of times what the revisions come into play. It's just like, oh, hey, it's something that's second nature for them. Oh, there has to be more spacing between the logo and text.
Right.
It's like,
exactly.
Yep, totally on us. Let's fix it real quick. That's 5.1, 5.2.
Exactly.
That's not version 4 to 5. That's version 5.1 to 5.2. Right. Yeah.
But I'd have to say, like, if any company's listening to this, especially ones that aren't video production companies, they need to realize that it is vital to have a collaborative partner in this type of creation, this type of creative.
Yeah.
If you don't have that, you aren't going to be happy. Your video production company should never say, oh, we won't take any of your feedback back.
Yeah.
It's not their baby.
But I'm sure you've worked with companies when you were on the other side of the table who do kind of act that way, right?
Yeah,
I mean, I know I have.
Plenty of times where video production companies are just like, how dare you question my creative?
Right.
We've got expertise. We've got knowledge. We have subject matter experts. We have thought leaders. We have all that stuff on staff. But at the end of the day, BU, our client in this case, knew exactly what they needed this video to say. They know all those things because they're 40 hours a week.
We're the vessel for it, not we're the vessel for their vision more than anything else.
Right.
And
it's so
it's
important.
Their baby.
You need to find a good partner when it comes to that. If you're doing video production, again, you might spend a little bit of money, but if you don't have a good partner in this system, you're going to walk away just frustrated.
Disappointed.
Disappointed.
Yeah. I think that's a super important thing. And I think sometimes people are surprised working with us because I do think it's a little bit of a different experience. Sometimes people will be like, oh, can I get that? Can I get that different? Can I get some of that raw footage? Can I have some? I'm like, yeah, it's yours.
Right,
like,
you bought it technically.
Yeah, like, we want you to use
yours.
it. Like, we want you to have it. We want you to use it. And like, I think sometimes people are surprised by that. And that should be, in my opinion, that should be the norm. And I think we have that mindset because all of us for the most part have sat on the other side of the table too.
Experience not being able to like, hey, I need the B-roll because I have social channels. I've got all these other things I need to put that stuff out.
This is a perfect example, like talking about it feeding multimedia and different channels and stuff. And like, if there are elements of this that are going to help feed a print campaign, like I want them to have it.
Right.
Because ultimately, like, first of all, I'm proud of our work and I want it to be seen by as many people as possible. But also ultimately, just from like a logical standpoint, like I want their campaign to be successful so they look back at this and say like that was a good experience and I enjoyed working with them. So like the more we can enable people to do that, like the better off we are and the better off everyone will be.
So quick wrapping up, about to do it. We'll start kind of last couple of questions. What was the final output? Like what was the actual thing that was sent and what was the client's reaction?
So the video itself must have been a little longer than a minute long. So we talk about all this pre-production, post-production, hours of shooting, and it's down to, you boil it down to a minute.
Great.
So it was a really cool video at the end of the day. I think the still photos transitioning into the dolly shots with the video is one of the coolest things I think we've done in my mind. And from what I heard, the company, the client really enjoyed it. The emails I saw, and then otherwise I heard some other stuff too that the client told you. I don't know.
Yeah, no, super positive feedback. I think the most important thing is that when they went into this with an idea and said, oh, we really like this video, we like the way it makes us feel, this product made the client feel the same way. Right. And hopefully now it's out there in the world making their constituents feel the same way that initial video made them feel. So that's always a good feeling when the client looks at it and they say like, yes, we came to you with a question and you gave us an answer, more or less. And you talk about output. What's interesting is there's a video here, but we mentioned the multimedia campaign. And I think that's one of the things that's really cool from this is that this has legs in that there's a whole bunch of other stuff that this feeds for them and enables them to kind of to push out across different channels and have some legs throughout the rest of the summer here and maybe even throughout the rest of the year. So really cool to see it kind of used across medium in that way as well.
That is awesome, guys. Thank you so much for joining me. I think this is an awesome kind of revamped Create Smarter podcast, talking about some of our cool projects, really diving in deep. If anyone wants to get in contact with you, what's the best place? LinkedIn?
Yeah, of course. Always LinkedIn. And info@5tool Productions will go to all of us. So we'll all make sure you'll get one of us. It's like a grab bag. No one knows. Totally. Otherwise, it's just our first names at 5toolproductions.com.
And let's get creative with anyone. If you got ideas out there, reach out to us, 5toolproductions.com. Great website to kind of go see what we're putting out there, all that type of stuff. But for Connor, for Phil, for me, Kyle McNaught, thanks for watching or listening to the Create Smarter podcast.